one last kind of question for you, for all of you, before we can maybe throw open for questions. Sort of a more personal question, which is when you were covering, while you were covering this sort of event where it's highly emotionally charged, you have a lot of grief amongst the communities that you're covering. There are some physical challenges, physically getting around, finding places to, getting gas, getting food, the altitude that you mentioned, Alex. How do you make sure that you look after yourself, both your mental and your physical health, and how did you cope with that in Peru? Maybe Rodrigo, we'll start with you, and then we can circle back to Sam and Alex.
Yeah, in Peru it's very challenged to work because the altitude in the south was like, I spent almost 30. Alex, you said like 3 hours. Well, I spent like 34 hours to go back from Puno, Juliaca to Cusco, because I didn't want to get through all these blockades, the biggest ones in the normal road. So I went through all the mountain, and I had to sleep in the middle of nowhere. It was freezing with a local driver. It was complicated. It was very cold, rainy, and I didn't have a good vehicle, so we didn't know when the car was going to break in the middle of the mountain. It was, almost all the markets were closed, so it was very difficult sometimes to find a place to eat, to find people to, in the middle of nowhere, to tell you where was the road, where I can go, because what was the blockade more friendly to talk to them, and then you're right there, and you want to get through, but you spend like 3 hours talking to the people, and then the people wanted to do a ceremony, so they say, okay, please record these, take pictures of these, because if not, you don't get through the blockade. So it was a whole, ceremony for us also too. But it was nice also because we connected in another way with people. We live those moments with them also. We understood better the story. It was more complicated to work. It was more difficult, but at the same time, it was good to go to these remote towns and to talk to people and to spend time, because you need to talk. They want to explain you, and when they know that you are not local media, they want you to understand the whole problem. So they start talking. So yeah, it was interesting but very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Sam, maybe throw over to you, and I might add in the kind of the additional question is: was there any sort of survival kit that you took with you? Any key things that you had in your bag that you needed, and but also how you dealt with this, the fatigue and also the mental strain?
Yeah, I mean that like last minute hike to Machu Picchu, it was a very kind of spontaneous decision where this guide told us, I could take you now, we can start driving, and then you can hike tomorrow morning. And so we had to quickly pack a bag and knew that we were going to have to hike with it. So I had to be very, I had to be very decisive about kind of what I would need to pack. And honestly, I think the most important thing I brought with me was a headlamp, a head torch, because we ended up having to hike in the dark the next day when we were waiting for our little wooden cart to pick us up. And that ended up being really, really helpful. Luckily, the altitude wasn't as much of a problem for me there, but just the basic first aid kit was helpful. Having snacks, because as Rodrigo mentioned, a lot of the stores weren't open. We kind of had to go in prepared to find whatever we would find in that, in the town. But I think the security piece of it was really important to sort of stay in constant touch with people back in our newsroom. Luckily, we have a great security team in London that was always kind of checking in, whether it was, letting them know when things were escalating during a protest, or letting them know we had gotten back safe. But, it was a lot of logistics in this particular trip. But I just, as Rodrigo mentioned, just the exhaustion really hits, especially when you're at these high altitudes. I remember getting back from that long journey back from Machu Picchu. And it was like, you know, we finally went to bed at like 2 a.m. and then I had to wake up the next morning and write the story, you know, in a few hours the next day in like the altitude of Cusco, which, you know, when I'd been there just sort of reporting, I didn't feel it, but suddenly when you sit down to write, it's like my head was just throbbing. So I think it was, you know, you realize that it does hit you after a while, and the coca tea helped, and, you know, some random medicine I found at a pharmacy along the way.
Okay. And Alex, what was your experience with this, and how you prepared for it, and how you dealt with those sort of personal challenges?
Yeah, I mean, logistically, it was just kind of being prepared, you know, having satellite phone and making sure we're checking in and people know where we're kind of at all times, especially in these kind of like rural mountain areas where there's zero service and yeah, things aren't working always. On top of that, yeah, like all those things add up. It's just a lot of stress, right? Stress not knowing when you're going to get there, not knowing if you're going to be able to get through. We had like a car issues too at one point, and then on top of that, you have to file and do all these stories. And then yeah, there's also kind of the emotional burden, because you know, you're going to these places that suffer these really violent traumatic events, and you're asking repeatedly people to tell you about what is most likely the worst and most painful day in their life. And, you know, they're crying and really having a tough time getting through it. And it's just having to kind of put that aside for later and focus on kind of the job, right? And, you know, do your best to kind of tell this person's story. And yeah, luckily, I guess after that, I was able to see family, and that was good. Reuters offers a good counseling service too that I take advantage of, and it helps kind of unpack all of that and kind of ease the emotional aftermath of kind of, you know, absorbing all of that kind of emotion and sadness and trauma and trying to make sense of it.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for sharing that.